Presentation. You can submit questions through the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen throughout the presentation, and then time permitting, at the end of the session, I will review the questions and provide answers. We will be posting today's presentation to the ISB SAT PSAT website after today's session. Without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. Our goals today are to focus on the SSD coordinators and to be able to provide a review of common accommodations as well as the request process and provide additional resources and support materials that SSD coordinators may find useful. First, I wanted to start off with some key dates. We'll talk about the administration dates first. As part of the establishment survey that was distributed this fall, districts selected from one of two SAT primary test dates, either April 14th or March 25th, 2020. The primary test date will be used by all standard test takers, as well as some accommodation types that can test on a single day or in the standard testing room, such as large print test books, some extended time testers, and preferential seating or wheelchair accessibility. This year's accommodated testing window will run from April 14th through April 28th, 2020, or March 25th through April 7th, 2020, depending on your primary administration date. The makeup testing date of April 28th, 2020 will be used for students who missed testing on the primary test day. As a note, students that test within the accommodated testing window will not have a designated makeup date because they can test and complete testing at any point during the accommodated testing window. As part of the establishment survey, districts also selected from one of two primary administration dates for PSAT 10 and PSAT 8-9. They chose either April 14th, 15th, or 16th, 2020, or April 20th, 21st, or 22nd, 2020. As a reminder, all schools in a district must administer the PSAT 8-9 and PSAT 10 in the same primary test date window, and the entire grade level must test on the same day. New this year, all makeup testing for PSAT 10 and PSAT 8-9 will take place on April 28th, 2020. Similar to SAT, students that are approved for accommodations will not have a designated makeup date because they can complete testing at any point during the accommodated testing window, which runs from April 14th through April 28th. For the accommodations process, there are a number of dates to be aware of as the SSD coordinator. First and foremost is the entry deadline for College Board approved accommodations requests. This deadline is February 24th for schools testing in April, or February 4th for schools testing SAT in March. As long as you have an AI code and access to SSD Online, you can begin submitting these requests now. We will support a late request window if you have students who are newly enrolled at your school, are newly classified at an eligible grade level, or who have a newly identified disability. You can continue to request accommodations for students in these scenarios through March 6th for April testing or February 17th for the SAT in March. If you have students that need state-allowed accommodations or EL students that require extended time for testing, the windows for these requests will open no later than January 14th. You may see the links on your SSD dashboard appear as early as the end of December or early January. You can begin entering your accommodations requests as soon as you see these go live. All scenarios for situations that arrive after the deadline, but prior to test day, submit the accommodation or support request in SSD Online. Then call the Illinois Educator Support Line, select the SSD office to ensure that the request can be reviewed and that materials can arrive in time for testing. Similar to last year, you'll use SSD Online as the primary tool for submitting accommodations requests for all three assessments. For the state-provided SAT, PSAT 10, PSAT 8-9, accommodations must be entered into the SSD Online system. Two other pieces of information that will be helpful as the SSD coordinator is the Non-Standard Administration Report, or the NAR. This provides a list of all students who are approved for accommodations, the accommodations they were approved for, and the information on what materials they will use, when they will test, whether they test over 1 day or 2 days, as well as the script that should be read to these students. The NAR will be available approximately 30 days prior to testing. There is another report that's called the eligibility roster, and this is available now. The eligibility roster shows a listing of all students at your school, the accommodations that have been requested, and their request status, whether they're approved or pending. As you're beginning to look at students approved for testing with accommodations, you can use the eligibility roster to begin these activities until the NAR becomes available. Spend a little bit of time talking about the types of accommodations and supports that are available. College Board offers the same accommodations and alternate test formats for all three assessments, the PSAT 8-9, PSAT 10, and SAT. Requests for accommodations and alternate test formats should align with the accommodations listed in the student's IEP or 5 plan. We have supports that are available to all students, such as repeating directions and time remaining announcements. Every student is offered these supports as part of a standard test administration. We have accommodations that use the standard test format, such as breaks or extended time. And then we have alternate test formats, where what's delivered to the school is a completely unique set of materials to support that student's testing. Arch print or Braille would be good examples of an alternate test format. We also have supports that are offered to English learners, and they include translated test directions, word-to-word bilingual glossaries, and 50% extended time. As you know, College Board is committed to making sure that students with disabilities and EL students can take our exams with the accommodations and supports they need, and we do consider all submitted requests. Accommodations need to be submitted for all students participating in the SAT, PSAT 10, and PSAT 8-9, and SSD Online is the point of entry for all requests. The bulk of your requests will be for College Board accommodations. Students that receive College Board approved accommodations will receive college and scholarship reportable scores. These accommodations are designed for students with disabilities, and with limited exception, once approved for the accommodation, a student remains approved for that accommodation for other College Board testing throughout their high school career. If they took PSAT 10 last year and they were approved as a 10th grader for a College Board accommodation, you don't need to submit a new request this year for SAT unless something has changed with their disability or accommodation needs. The second type of request you will submit into SSD Online is the EL 50% extended time support. This support is for eligible EL students and must be submitted each test administration for students who qualify. For example, if you have a 10th grader who will use this support, if they still qualify next year as an 11th grader, you'll need to reapply. Students who use this support will receive college and scholarship reportable scores. Finally are the state allowed accommodations, or SAAs. These are specific accommodations defined between College Board and ISB. Students that use these accommodations must have a documented need in their IEP or 504 plan. SAA should be used as an exception because students who test using an SAA will not receive a college or scholarship reportable score. Similar to the EL extended time support, SAAs must be requested for each administration, and they're only available for the state-provided assessments of SAT and PSAT 10 and 8-9. As an SSD coordinator, you'll be the primary person responsible for communicating with the College Board SSD office. You'll be responsible for submitting accommodations and support requests. You'll work with the test coordinator to schedule testing rooms and staff necessary to test students with accommodations, and to prepare computers for students testing with MP3 or assistive technology. You'll also be responsible for monitoring and printing the NAR for room planning purposes. If you're a new SSD coordinator, the first thing you'll want to do is gain entrance to the SSD Online system. You'll need to go online and print out the SSD coordinator form using the attachment or the URL that's included in this presentation. You can find the form also on collegeboard.org/SSD. You'll need a principal signature, and then you'll fax the form back to the College Board. Within a couple of days, you'll get an email with an access code that will allow you to link your College Board account in SSD Online. I'm going to walk through next some of the common College Board accommodations that we have available. Accommodations should be consistent with the accommodations that the student has in their IEP or 504 plan. Students should be familiar with the accommodations they will be using for testing and be consistently using these accommodations for other test administrations. Core terminology can vary from the language used in an Illinois IEP or 504 plan. For example, you may have a student whose IEP indicates they need assessments read aloud. At the College Board, you actually have a couple of options for this student. You can use a reader, which would be a human reader, or the MP3 audio format, where the student listens to the test being read to them through headphones. You should determine the best option in consult with the student and their family. One piece to remember, particularly with timing accommodations, is that you want to keep in mind whether the student needs assistance with on-the-clock time when they're actually taking the test, or off-the-clock time when they need assistance with the time in between testing. The accommodations that we're going to walk through next are some of the most frequently requested. We do review requests for other accommodations needs for students as they're appropriate. These accommodations and their associated descriptions and considerations will also be available in the SSD Accommodations and Support Handbook, which should be posted to the SAT and PSAT website by the new year. With time accommodations, there are multiple variations. The first is extended time, which gives the student more testing time. It can either be for the entire test, which you'll see written as reading, or for a specific section of the test, such as math or writing. For students who took the PSAT 10 last year as a 10th grader, now that they're in 11th grade and will be taking the SAT, you should review their accommodations requests to see if a writing accommodation needs to be included with the addition of the essay. The timing of testing with extended time will vary between 1 and 2 days depending on the assessment and the type of extended time. Similar to last year, students must be given the entire time for which they were approved. There is no self-pacing where a student can move to the next section when they finish. They must be provided the full time allotted. For breaks, this is off the clock time. There are a few options here as well. Extra breaks is adding a break or more frequent breaks to the student's testing day. They'll get standard breaks, and then they'll also get a break halfway through the longer sections. There's also the option for extended breaks, where a student needs a longer duration of off-the-clock time in between testing. They will get a break twice as long as the standard break lengths. For students that use this accommodation, there may be others that you request at the same time, such as permission to eat or take medication, and these need to be requested in addition to extended breaks. There is another option, breaks as needed, and this would be used in a situation where a student needs to break from testing, but they're better suited being able to break on their own time versus a scheduled time. These are usually physical or medical conditions where they can't plan when they'll need a break. The student will request a break, and the proctor will need to manage the timing of the test. The student breaks, the clock stops, and when they return, the clock starts again. This is often associated with other types of accommodations. Because the proctor needs to carefully monitor the testing time for each individual student, this must be administered in a one-to-one setting. Finally, there's permission to test blood sugar, which allows specifically for a student to be able to take time off the clock to test their blood sugar. It does not automatically give them extra or extended breaks, and it's typically requested with one of the break accommodations. It also does not automatically permit the student to have a cell phone for this purpose. If you have a student that uses a cell phone for their glucose monitoring, you'll need to request that as well. For presentation, we talked a little bit before about the MP3 and reader. You'll notice that the timing varies depending on which accommodation is used. There's also one other big difference. A reader requires one-to-one testing because an adult is reading the test aloud to the student. When choosing between these, you'll want to make sure that you make the right choice for the student and how they will perform best. MP3 audio, you can test multiple students at the same time, but the student needs to be comfortable listening and using the MP3 version of the test. Next, we have other presentations of the test, such as Assistive Technology Compatible, Braille, and American Sign Language. ATC is a digital version of the test that's delivered on a flash drive designed to work with the student's device, such as a screen reader or other assistive technology. Students using this accommodation are automatically given extended time writing section only. Students must be provided the full amount of time. When requesting ATC, the SSD coordinator will also be requested to document the type of technology they're using, such as JAWS or another screen reader device. For Braille, we'll be providing the UEB Braille format with a Braille figure supplement. Students using this accommodation are also typically approved for a scribe or a Braille writer for students to record their answers. You're able to submit a request for text directions to be delivered using American Sign Language. Test directions are the only listening portion of the SAT, PSAT 10, and PSAT 8-9. Any American Sign Language interpreters must meet all testing staff agreements. For recording answers, there are a number of options depending on the student's need. The first is a writer or scribe. We also offer large block answer sheets, and for SAT, the option of using a computer for the essay. For writer or scribe, extended time is provided since the student is going to need to speak their answers to the scribe to record. If you're using the computer for essay, the computer must be a school computer. No student personal devices are allowed. Setting, we have small group testing, home or hospital testing, preferential seating, and permission for food and medication. For small group and preferential seating, for school day, you're planning the students' rooms, so you can make a decision as to how many students are seated in the room and where a particular student is assigned to sit. The value of submitting these requests in SSD online is for those students who may opt to take a Saturday SAT who truly need preferential seating. This way we ensure it's on the record for that student for future testing. Permission for food or medication is similar to testing blood sugar. You'll often request this with other accommodations, such as extra breaks. If students are approved, you'll need to request additional breaks separately. We also have a standard policy regarding how EpiPens are handled. You can find these details in the coordinator manuals when they become available online in January. Now let's take a look at the supports that we offer for English learner students. English learners will be able to utilize EL supports for the spring 2020 state-provided assessments. These supports include the use of an approved word-to-word bilingual glossary, translated test directions, and 50% extended time. Students can use one or any of these supports in combination, and students will receive college and scholarship reportable scores when any of these supports are used. College Board offers 50% extended time for EL students as a support that allows for college reportable scores. This is a different request type in SSD Online, similar to a College Board or state allowed accommodation. Requests for EL extended time must be submitted in advance. Unlike the other EL supports, we need to make sure that we provide you with the appropriate test materials for the student and to make sure that they display on the NAR so that you know where and when to test these students. Similar to the College Board extended time accommodation, students approved for EL 50% extended time must be provided the full amount of testing time. They cannot move forward to another section until the full time has elapsed. We've continued to expand the list of approved word-to-word glossaries at over 100 languages. Use of a word-to-word glossary does not need to be requested in advance. The glossary is listed on the approved list that will be posted to ISBE's SAT PSAT website after the new year. You may use this glossary for testing. Students using this support will receive college and scholarship reportable scores. The third EL support is the use of translated test directions. We will provide PDFs of the translated test directions for all 3 assessments on ISBE's website in February. The languages will be consistent from last year with the addition of French for spring 2020. We also continue to support on-the-fly translation if there's another language that a student needs translated directions for. Similar to the word-to-word glossary, use of translated test directions does not need to be requested in advance, and students will receive reportable scores. Next, we'll briefly look at the state-allowed accommodations offered for this spring's testing. For state-allowed accommodations, also known as SAAs, students should have the accommodations that they're using in their IEP or 504 plan. It's important to make sure that students and parents understand that these scores will not be college or scholarship reportable. Any accommodations that you find in the SAA dashboard will align to an accommodation that's available as College Board approved. In addition, SAAs cannot be used outside of state testing. The window for submitting state-allowed accommodations begins on January 14th. Again, if you see the link for the state-allowed accommodations dashboard in SSD Online prior to January 14th, there is a chance that it will become visible sooner than that, and you may begin entering these accommodation types as soon as you see that available. If the EL supports that we reviewed previously won't fully meet the need of your EL students, there are a couple of additional state allowed accommodations that you may consider, with the caveat that applying for these additional accommodations will not result in a reportable score. These include extended time, extra breaks, a reader in their native language, a writer, a scribe, or other accommodations. In any instance where you're applying for a state allowed accommodation of other, we do ask that you contact ISB's assessment office in advance for guidance so that they can provide you with the appropriate direction prior to submitting that request. We're going to walk at a very high level some of the activities that you as the SSD coordinator can begin to undertake now in preparation for test day. If you're a returning SSD coordinator, this screen should look familiar to you, especially if you submitted accommodations last year. This is the SSD Online dashboard, and it will be your home page when you're entering the SSD Online system. The dashboard will include the list of students with accommodations, including the status of their request. In the top right-hand corner, you'll see a link to the eligibility roster, and once the NAR is available, the link to generate the NAR. The first thing that you'll want to work on between now and the submission deadlines is to identify the students that will be testing this year, confirm the accommodations that they'll need, and confirm who's already in the system with approved accommodations. If you have new students that will need to test with accommodations, start that process now. If the students already has approved accommodations, you'll want to review the details in the eligibility roster to make sure that the approved accommodations still match their current IEP or 504 plan. To verify that the student's information, such as their name, date of birth, and graduation date, to make sure that they're correct. You'll also want to confirm, based on the plan, that the student is consistently using these accommodations for school and district assessments. For any students that no longer attend your school, you are able to remove them. You can print the eligibility roster and annotate the printout for students that are no longer at your school and fax that report to the SSD office to have these students removed from your roster. This means that you'll no longer see them on your dashboard or NAR. Students do automatically fall off the report a year after graduation, so you don't need to do anything to remove students who have graduated. There are two paths for College Board approved accommodations requests. The first is the school verification process. This is the route that the vast majority of accommodation requests will go down. These are going to be for some of the more common accommodations. As part of the process, the SSD coordinator will verify that the student meets the eligibility criteria, that they have documentation on file through the student's plan, and that the student consistently uses these accommodations on other testing. The secondary path, the document review path. Documentation must be provided for College Board review if the requested accommodation is not included in the student's plan or is not being used for school tests. If the student is requesting certain accommodations, such as more than 100% extended time, large print test books over 20-point font, and finally any of the assistive technology compatible requests, so that we can get an understanding of the type of device or software that's being used to make sure there are no concerns with test security or test construct. If the student, you also would be requested to submit documentation if the student does not have a diagnosed disability, or if the disability is listed as other, or the accommodation is listed as other in SSD Online. And then the last place where documentation would be requested would be if the student does not have a formal plan that meets College Board criteria. All state allowed accommodations requests and requests for the EL 50% extended time support are automatically approved and won't require documentation. If you are asked to provide additional documentation, a list of example documentation will be provided. You will want to provide documentation that answers the following questions. What is the student's disability? How is the student functionally impacted by the disability? And how does the requested accommodation meet the student's need? Any type of documentation you can provide that will tell us the answers to those questions is the type of documentation that we're looking for. You can upload the documentation directly into SSD Online, or you can print and fax the documentation to the SSD office. Now we're going to take a quick look at the steps to submit accommodations or support requests in SSD Online. If you need additional details, I highly recommend that you review the SSD Accommodations e-module. The link to that is posted on the ISB website, and it provides step-by-step instructions on some of the most common activities in SSD Online. To submit a new request, you're going to click Submit Accommodation Request in the upper right-hand corner of the SSD homepage. You'll be prompted to enter some basic student information, answer questions about the student's disability and requested accommodations, and about the student's plan and documentation. You can begin submitting these accommodations now. If you want to submit a new state allowed accommodation, you'll select the Go to State Allowed Accommodations dashboard link on the left-hand side of the screen. You'll be asked to enter basic student information and select the state allowed accommodations. Requests for state allowed accommodations are automatically approved. No supporting documentation is required. The path to request EL 50% extended time is similar to the state allowed accommodations, except you'll click the EL Supports dashboard link to enter these requests. These two links will show up no later than January 14th. One of the first steps in the College Board approved, state allowed, or EL support flows is to obtain or confirm parental consent. The reason for this is to make sure that the student's parents understand and agree to allow you to share information with the College Board about their child. You want to make sure that you're following your district policies regarding parental consent. Some districts may already include this as part of your annual IEP review process, or you may have parental consent forms already on file. We do also have a form that's available through SSD Online. Really, the purpose of this is to protect the student and the school to make sure that their information regarding their disabilities and their accommodations needs can be shared with the College Board. The College Board uses two sources to determine your material orders for the state-provided SAT, PSAT 10, and PSAT 8-9. For standard materials, we'll use the number of students that were included in the pre-ID file submitted based on January 2020 data in ISB's Student Information System. For non-standard materials, we look at the number of students and the types of approved accommodations in SSD Online for all eligible grade levels. This means we will ship non-standard test materials for all students approved for accommodations in SSD Online under your AI code in grades 9, 10, 11, and 12, regardless of whether they've been pre-ID'd at your school or are required to test. This is why we ensure that you make sure that your dashboard is current and accurate, specifically with the student's graduation date and date of birth. Prior to the deadline, you'll want to confirm that all students you're planning to test at your school are listed on your school's SSD Online dashboard. Materials shipped to the school where the student's accommodation is approved in SSD Online. You can find steps to transfer a student to your dashboard in the SSD handbook that will be posted the beginning of the year. If you submit an accommodations request after the deadline, as a reminder, you'll need to call the SSD office to confirm that materials can ship in time for testing. Pre-ID labels will be shipped to each school that's listed as the testing school in the SAT and PSAT pre-ID reports so that they may be affixed to student answer sheets. Next, I'll walk you through some of the most common activities related to managing previously submitted accommodations requests in SSD Online. For students with prior approvals, the SSD coordinator should make sure that the accommodation that the students have already been approved for match the student's current IEP, 504 plan, or other formal plan accommodations. SSD coordinators should verify that the accommodations approved match the student's current identified IEP or 504 accommodation needs, that the student's name, birth date, and graduation date are correct, that the student is consistently using the testing accommodation on school and district assessments. As long as all three of the above criteria are met, no further action is needed. Students remain approved for College Board accommodations until they graduate. If you have students that were approved for state allowed accommodations or the 50% extended time EL support, and these accommodations or supports are still appropriate, they'll need to be requested each year. If you need to make a change to the student's information, change their approved accommodations, or request additional accommodations, this would be done through a change request. If a student has prior approved accommodations and they no longer qualify due to a change in their IEP or 504 plan, the accommodation should be removed from SSD Online. As Tech Day approaches, check your dashboard to confirm that students listed still attend your school and that the information for each student is accurate. You may need to make changes to the listed students, student information, or requested accommodations. To submit a change request from the SSD Online dashboard, locate the student that requires the change, select Options, and click on Create Change Request. You'll print the change request form, annotate the form with the requested changes, and fax this form to SSD. SSD coordinators can transfer students to and from their dashboard. The first step is to attain a student's College Board SSD number. The following are ways that you can obtain a student's SSD number if the student is new to your school. Ask the student or parent if they have a copy of the eligibility letter. Have the student sign into their College Board account to obtain a copy of the eligibility letter. Contact the student's previous school and request a copy of the eligibility letter or their SSD number, or contact the SSD department directly. Please ensure, if you're calling SSD, that the student is present in order to provide their permission to give the SSD number to the school. To add the student with previously approved accommodations to your dashboard, you'll click Submit Accommodations Request in the top right corner of the dashboard, and you'll answer yes to these two questions. Has a student eligibility form already been submitted for this student, and is this a transfer student? You'll be asked for the student's name, date of birth, and SSD number. If the student requires accommodations that are different from those approved or is not receiving the approved accommodations at your school, documentation review may be required. To remove a student from your dashboard that no longer attends your school, you'll print the eligibility roster, annotate the roster by crossing off the name of the student who needs to be removed, and then faxing the annotated roster to SSD. Students will stay on your dashboard for 1 year after graduation in the chance they need to take the SAT their senior year or after they graduate. You don't need to remove these students from your dashboard. We have a number of tools and resources that are available to assist SSD coordinators through the College Board accommodations process. The coordinator and accommodated testing manuals remain the gold source for information regarding administering the SAT, PSAT 10, and PSAT 8-9 in a non-standard setting. These manuals include policies, procedures, and the scripts that will be needed to test students with accommodations. We have created an on-demand training module for SSD coordinators. It includes much of the same information that we've shared on today's webinar, but it also includes a step-by-step tutorial of some of the most common activities performed in SSD Online. This module is available now on the ISB website. Users can opt to review the entire module end to end, which would take approximately 40 minutes, or they can pick specific topics that may be useful as a real-time job aid or as a refresher on a particular subject. We are also creating a new College Board accommodations and support handbook. The handbook will include the information that's shared in this presentation regarding descriptions and timing for some of the most common accommodations. It will be available shortly on the ISB assessment website. Now we're going to take a look at the NAR, the Non-Standard Administration Report, the SAT. For those of you that administered the SAT last year, the NAR will look the same. It's broken into multiple sections, which tell you which students can test together based on their testing groups, the color book they'll use, and whether they'll test in 1 day or 2. The first section will show the students that must test on the primary test day. The second section will include students that are able to test within the accommodated testing window, and then the third section will include students approved for state-allowed accommodations. This is the PSAT NAR, which you'll notice looks a little different than the SAT NAR. You'll have multiple sections. The first lists the students with accommodations, and then a second section where you can see each student and the accommodations they're approved for. It also provides guidance on how to test specific types of accommodations. There are additional guidance included within the manuals for determining appropriate groups for students to test and who can test together. All right, we're going to take a quick look at some of the MP3 changes that are upcoming for spring 2020. Beginning in August 2019, students that were approved for use of an MP3 audio accommodation will now receive test content via a streaming application instead of a flash drive. There are two steps that are required of SSD coordinators or their designated proctors in order to administer the MP3 audio format to approved students. Prior to test day, an application needs to be installed and tested on each computer that's used for MP3 audio testing, and the SSD coordinator needs to test the application. You can begin this step now. On test day, the SSD coordinator or proctor will download the MP3 audio files for approved students. As the first step, which can be started now, the MP3 streaming application must be installed prior to test day. If computers at your school are set up to require staff or students to sign in, the application needs to be installed on a user profile for the computer that the student will be signed into on test day. The MP3 streaming application will only be visible as a desktop icon on the user account it was originally installed on. Detailed instructions are available on the MP3 streaming application access page in SSD Online. If you tested students in the fall using the new streaming application, you've already completed this step to download the application on those computers. Once the application has been installed on each student's computer, you must launch the sample test form on each computer individually to confirm functionality, using the account the student will sign in on test day, if a login is required. We do ask if you encounter an issue that you call the SSD office right away so that we can work with you to help resolve the technical issues well before the opening of the accommodated testing window. Once the application has been installed and you've tested the functionality, when you get to test day, you'll actually need to launch the MP3 streaming application and download the student's test form. If the number of MP3 test takers at your school is small, the proctor can choose to do this on each student's computer. Otherwise, the MP3 script does include instructions for the students to complete this step. You'll need the NAR handy on test day because the MP3 streaming application requires each student's SSD number to access the test form. When testing is complete, all test content will be automatically removed from the computers, and the application can remain installed for future College Board testing. All right, that brings us to the end of our presentation. Now I'm going to take a look through the questions that were submitted and see if there would be some that would be useful to read aloud for the benefit of the audience. All right, first question, bear with me as I open them up. Okay. Last year, the Breaks as Needed accommodation has a booklet that was color coded and this as the same time color as extended time, 2-day testing. In the chart, it says that it's 1 day. Should we still expect breaks as needed to have the extended time color code? So the color coding is actually not specific to the accommodation type. It's actually specific to whether the student tests on the primary test day. In those cases, they'll test using a purple test book for SAT. And then they're approved for an accommodation that allows them to test during the accommodated window. So they're in section 2 of the SAT NAR. Then they'll use a blue test book. And so that does include things such as breaks as needed. It also includes 50 and 100% extended time and any of the other accommodations that test within the accommodated testing window. For students who already have permission to test blood sugar and do use a cell phone, do we need to put in a change request updating that information? If they have approval to test blood sugar and they use a cell phone to do this testing, then a second accommodations request does need to be submitted for that student to allow them to bring a cell phone into the testing room. So there is a second accommodation request that is for use of a cell phone to test blood sugar. So yes, you would put in a change request to update their accommodation information within SSD Online. How many students can be tested in a small group setting? As we talked about for some of the setting situations, this really school day situation is dependent on how you as the SSD coordinator, the test coordinator, and the proctor choose to set your rooms. We really do ask that you take the students' needs in mind when you're determining what constitutes a small group setting. But in many cases, it would be 10 or less students in the room for testing. Again, if you have the capability to test a student alone or with 5 students in a room, all of these would meet the small group setting. It really should be based on what would best meet the student's needs as documented in their plan. How far ahead of time do we have to submit EL supports? So we went through the deadlines at the very beginning of the presentation. EL supports are due at the same timeline as the standard accommodations requests. So if you're testing the SAT in March, your accommodations are going to be due on February 17th. And if you're testing the SAT or PSAT for April testing, the late request would be March 6th, sorry, but your primary deadline is February 24th. So we do ask February 24th for any assessments being administered in April, and then February 4th for students who are testing the SAT in March, that you align your EL submissions with this request. And the reason for this is because we do submit and send special materials to support the EL 50% extended time. So we want to make sure that we get that in time to make those material orders on your behalf. The other 2 EL supports, word-to-word bilingual glossaries, and translated test directions don't require advanced submission. You don't need to put them in SSD Online at all. We have a couple of questions about getting access to this content. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we will be posting a copy of this presentation to ISBE's assessment website, so you'll be able to print off the presentation from there. We have a couple more questions about the deadlines for submitting. So we did walk through those at the beginning. As I just mentioned, for April testing, the deadline is February 24th. For March SAT, it's February 4th. In addition, there is a key dates timeline that's posted on ISBE's assessment website. So I encourage you to go to their website and to print that out. That has a variety of deadlines, including all of the different accommodations deadlines. It also includes other important information, such as when pre-ID files will be submitted by ISBE, when materials will arrive, and then each of the administration dates and accommodated windows. There are some questions about schools that experienced MP3 issues during fall testing. I do encourage you, as I mentioned during the setup, to please download the application and test the application well before test day. We're recommending that you perform this activity at least 3 to 4 weeks prior to testing. And if you encounter any issues, please call the SSD office through your the Illinois school support number, and they'll be able to help you technically troubleshoot if you're having issues, so that we can make sure that your students are able to test. Let's see what else we have. Will the proctor or SSD coordinator need to log into the MP3 application before launching the test on test day? Yes, they will. So whoever has access credentials to log into each computer on test day, they'll need to launch the MP3 streaming application, and then either the proctor or the student can download the test content as instructed in the manual. But the SSD coordinator or the proctor will need to launch the application on each computer because they need to enter their SSD Online credentials to do this. Can I give a student all the tests in one day if they get extended time, or does it have to be split into 2 days? So if a student is approved for 50 or 100% extended time for the SAT, it needs to be split over 2 days. This is to make sure that the length of testing is manageable for the student, and that they, because they aren't allowed to take a break for lunch or to have, an extended time to eat or take a break, um, are standard, so they do need to complete testing over 2 days. That can't be delivered in a single day. It says we use our school library as a testing room, which has different sections but no walls to separate rooms. Can students using MP3 as a testing accommodation test in one section of our library, while students with just extended time test in another section? Um, I would suggest calling SSD just to run this by them, because I probably would need a few more specifics on exactly how big the library is and how far the students are separated. The main thing to take into consideration would be whether there would be a disruption to either of the students. So one would be, as you're thinking about the extended time students and the proctor reading that script aloud, would that conflict with the MP3 students that are listening to headphones' ability to hear their test content being delivered by their headphones? A question about the EL dashboard and whether or not it's open. So as I mentioned in the presentation, both the dashboard and the state allowed accommodations dashboard will both be open no later than January 14th. There's a question about what needs to be attached when requesting accommodations. So as I mentioned, there are two different flows. The first is school verified, and as long as things such as the disability and the accommodation being documented in a student's IEP plan or 504 plan, being consistently used by the student for other testing, a lot of those accommodations requests will flow down our school verified path, and no additional documentation will be required. If you go back in the presentation, there were a couple of accommodation types that do require additional documentation. And in those instances, we actually provide you a list of example documentation. Not all of it needs to be provided, but we do provide you some samples of things that would be relevant for that student. And a couple of other questions about MP3. A school asking if they can the paper format because they may have issues with using computers. Again, this is why we're asking schools to please download the MP3 application well before test day, to call the SSD office if you experience any technical issues, so that we can determine the best method for your students to test. In some cases, it may mean that we're shipping flash drives so that those students are able to test. If you wouldn't be able to use flash drives in a computer, then SSD would need to work with you to get those students approved for a reader so that somebody could read aloud to those students. Okay, so there's just one other clarifying question about the MP3. So on test day, what will happen is the SSD coordinator or the doctor will log into each computer as if it's starting from a blank screen. You're going to log into the computer if your computers require a login, whatever you need to get to the desktop so that you can see the application for the MP3 streaming. Once you click on that application, either the proctor or the SSD coordinator will need to enter their credentials, so their username and password that they use to get into SSD online. Once that launches, there are instructions for either the student or the proctor to begin the test content download. But the SSD coordinator or the proctor do need to do the initial login into the MP3 streaming application on test day. And that is the end of the questions. As I mentioned, I will be ISB will be posting a copy of this presentation to their website. I would expect that that will be up in the next few days. And as always, if you have additional questions or there are accommodation specific items, if it's anything related to ISB policy, how something should be treated in a student's IEP or 504 plan, or how to translate something that's in a student's IEP or 504 plan into a College Board accommodation, we do ask that you contact the ISB assessment office. But if it's anything related to College Board accommodations, state allowed accommodations, or EL supports, use of SSD online, how to arrange for testing these students, room planning, etc., please feel free to reach out to the SSD office. You can use the school day support number that's listed in each of the manuals. It's the same number that was also included at the end of this presentation, and that will provide information or a link directly to the SSD office, and they'll be able to help you answer any questions that you might have. With that, I'm going to end today's presentation. Thank you everyone for your attendance and for your great questions, and I'm sure I will be talking to all of you soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.